It's November 4th, 2013. The Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers are in the middle of an NFC North showdown when Bears defensive end Shane McClellan sacks Aaron Rodgers and fractures his collarbone. Not only did the Packers lose the game, but they would also lose Rodgers until the final week of the regular season. With the not-so-mighty quarterback trio of Scott Tolzien, Seneca Wallace, and Matt Flynn, the Packers limped through the second half of their season and sit at 7-7-1 entering the final week of the year just in time for Rodgers to return. And what do you know, despite only winning 2 of their 7 games without Rodgers, the NFC North title is still very much up for grabs. Thanks to Detroit crumbling in December, all that stood in Green Bay's way was, you guessed it, the 8-7 Bears. The 2 historic franchises went to battle in Week 17. Winner claims the North and hosts a playoff game. Loser watches January football on their couch. In a back-and-forth thriller, Rodgers and co. trailed 28-27 with under a minute to go, facing 4th and 8. Green Bay has already had to convert a 4th down twice on this drive, and with only 1 timeout, the Packers have to convert on this play or their season is over. What better time for Aaron Rodgers to remind the city of Chicago why they hate him with every fiber of their being.
Rodgers gets out, flips it, Cobb, touchdown, Randall Cobb.
I'll give credit to the Bears where it's due. At least them injuring the opposing team's star quarterback wasn't headlined as one of the state's best sports achievements of the year and put on a newspaper. Either way, some sweet payback for the man whose season was nearly shut down prematurely by the very same team, but rest assured it gets so much better than that. These are the greatest revenge moments in NFL history. Of the 6 quarterbacks that were picked ahead of Tom Brady, Chad Pennington was the only one to be selected in the first round. After being handed the reins in his 3rd season, Pennington led the Jets for the next 6 years, making the playoffs 3 times. However, injuries halted his development in New York. From 2002 to 2007, Pennington played in all 16 games in a season only twice. In partial thanks to playing through injuries, 2007 was Pennington's worst season, getting benched and only playing in 9 games. After the season, the Jets acquired Brett Favre and kicked Chad Pennington to the curb. Just 1 day later, he signed with New York's division rival in the Miami Dolphins. Pennington was now in charge of a squad that was fresh from narrowly avoiding an 0-16 season and now had a first-year head coach. All Pennington did was have the league's best completion percentage, throw a personal best 3,600 yards, and enter the final week of the season with a chance to win the division. Sure, this team is best known for the revolutionary Wildcat offense, but Chad Pennington was the runner-up for league MVP that year. And who else would Miami's final obstacle be other than Favre and the Jets, who were also fighting for their playoff lives? Well, perhaps it was fate, but Chad Pennington played one of the best games of his life, completing 22 of his 30 passes along with 2 touchdowns and 0 picks with a passer rating of over 113. Pennington drastically outplayed Favre, got the win, and clinched the AFC East while eliminating the Jets, ending both Favre's and head coach Eric Mangini's time with the team, the same coach that kicked Pennington to the curb to get Favre. To this day, the 2008 Miami Dolphins are tied for the greatest single-season turnaround in NFL history. Prior to Y2K, Keyshawn Johnson had just about enough of the New York Jets, so much so that during the 1999 Pro Bowl, he went to Tampa Bay's Warren Sapp and pretty much begged his Buccaneers to trade for him so he could play on a contender. Sapp proposed his case to Dungy, so Tampa pulled the trigger and gave Johnson a hefty contract. In Week 4, the Jets and Buccaneers would face off, and in Keyshawn Johnson's attempt to make pretty much everyone his enemy, he had some chirping ready for one of his former teammates. It's clear that Johnson wasn't very fond of fellow receiver Wayne Chrebet, calling him the team mascot in his book about his rookie season, and then had this to say about Chrebet ahead of their Week 4 matchup. There's no beef with him. You're trying to compare a flashlight to a star. Flashlights only last so long. A star is in the sky forever. He's not even close to me, and anyone who knows football knows that. Pretty bold of him to say that, considering their production as teammates were fairly similar, but I digress. In the pair's first matchup as opponents, Keyshawn Johnson had, wait for it, 1 catch for 1 yard. Despite that, Tampa Bay still seemingly had this game in the bag thanks to their defense. Up 17-6 with 2 minutes to go. That was when the Jets scored a touchdown, then got the ball back after forcing a fumble against Tampa's Mike Allstott. With the ball back in their hands, of course the Jets looked for the flashlight in the final minute. Why wouldn't they?
With trying to scramble for extra yards all the time often results in a fumble.
And look at this, those Jets. Curtis Martin on the halfback option. So of all people, the flashlight signing on Wayne Chrebet. 21-17.
Jets win, and it's safe to say Coach Al Groh had some fun with this whole flashlight analogy.
The power of 46 flashlights can be pretty bright sometimes.
Smith requested a trade in 2013 after a shaky start, was in talks to potentially go to the 49ers, but in the ensuing offseason, the Panthers just cut him for nothing. Matter of fact, it was less than nothing. Carolina actually lost $2 million in cap space to get rid of him. Safe to say it was an unpleasant exit for one of the best players in franchise history. The next day, Smith wound up in Baltimore and made it very clear where his priorities lie in anticipation of meeting his former team. In Week 6, that's exactly what happened. If you expected anything less than one of the best games of Agent 89's career, then that's on you. We have one more wide receiver to talk about. This moment has been covered by YouTube legend KTO in a video that I'm sure at least some of you have already seen, but I'd be a fool not to cover it here. So for those of you who haven't, here we go. Seattle Seahawks franchise icon Steve Largent was entering his age 34 season, which would be the second to last of his career. In Week 1 against division rival Denver, yes, the Seahawks used to be in the AFC West, Largent took a brutal hit from Broncos safety Mike Harden. Largent suffered a concussion and lost multiple teeth. Since it's the 80s, Largent doesn't miss any time and is on the field for the rematch in Seattle with only 2 games to go. With both teams tied atop the division at 7-7, this game likely decided who wins the AFC West and goes to the playoffs. In the rematch, Denver's Jeremiah Castile and Seattle's Brian Blades get into a scuffle, with Castile clearly being the aggressor. But for whatever reason, the officials call offsetting penalties on both players. This sends the Kingdom into a furious rage, and with the Seahawks driving, what happened next is described as Steve Largent's favorite play in his Hall of Fame career, and it was something that you could not script any better.
Job of officiating right there. No retaliation. Craig on 3rd and 1. Blades intercepted by Harden. Oh, and Largent unloaded and got the ball. Holy cow, what a shot.
The Seahawks won in a blowout, claimed the AFC West, and made the postseason. The last player versus team revenge story in this video is arguably the most famous instance of it in NFL history. Everyone knows Joe Montana, the unquestioned GOAT until Brady showed up. Montana went 4 for 4 in the Super Bowl with the 1980s 49ers. His 1989 playoff run is one of the best of all time, and was not only a franchise icon, but a sports icon. It seemed sacrilegious for him to wear any uniform other than the cherry red 16, but after a devastating injury in the 1990 NFC Championship, which ended San Francisco's dreams of a three-peat, the 49ers decided to move on and ride with fellow future Hall of Famer Steve Young. Montana requested a trade and found himself on the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs had been a consistent playoff team through the 90s up to that point, but had a measly 1-3 record in them. Montana helped the Chiefs finally break through in 1993, knocking off the Steelers and Oilers to reach the AFC Championship, which the franchise hadn't done since 1969. But in Week 2 of the following season, Montana's Chiefs met Young and the 49ers at Arrowhead. In a grudge match against the team that showed Montana the door, he outperformed Young and got the win against his former team. I don't know the guy personally, but I bet you he thinks that this game is among his personal favorites. However, it does need to be mentioned that Young would get the last laugh. He won league MVP in 1994 and will go on to win Super Bowl 29, throwing for 6 touchdowns, now an NFL record that formerly belonged to, you guessed it, Joe Montana. Montana's head coach during 3 of those Super Bowls in the 80s has his own revenge story too, and it might be the very sweetest in NFL history. In 1968, Bill Walsh got a coaching gig with the Cincinnati Bengals, initially as the wide receivers coach and then the quarterbacks coach. Heading into 1976, the legendary Paul Brown stepped down as head coach, and Bill Walsh felt like he was ready to enter the top ranks. But for a reason that Walsh could never understand, he alleges that Paul Brown attempted to block Walsh from becoming a head coach in the NFL. Brown instead appointed Bill Tiger Johnson for the job and wanted Walsh to stay as offensive coordinator. He instead resigned and went to San Diego, but unbeknownst to him, Paul Brown would spend the rest of his days smack-talking Walsh to basically anyone who would listen, and refused to recommend him to anyone. This deeply bothered Walsh as he took some time in college until he got the top job with the 49ers. I think you know where this is going.
Owned the second half except for that drive. Anderson, Hollingsworth, the intended receiver, picked off by Eric Wright. Hits it. Won't start, I should say. Clark sees it, gets it. Story. 26-21, they are the world champion San Francisco 49ers.
Montana back to throw on first down, throws over the middle, completes it to Craig. Craig is to the 16.
Montana again is back to throw. He'll dunk over the middle.
Time remaining. Montana throws, sidelines, Price, 30 side. Montana to throw, completes it up the middle to Craig. Montana back to throw, throws over the middle. A fight, gets one way. Price is 20. He's down to the 9. At quarterback, in motion, comes Rice. Back to throw, Montana. Steps up, throws.
Walsh faced off against the Bengals 5 times in his career as head coach, running the same offense he used in Cincinnati to perfection. The Niners went 5-0. The Bengals are still waiting on their first Lombardi trophy to this day. So I have a couple more stories to tell, but for these we need to turn the clock way back. Bear with me as we go all the way back to 1931. Forget about the Super Bowl or the NFL championship for that matter. The NFL didn't even have a postseason at the time. The champion was simply whoever had the best regular season record. That's it. With 2 games to go in the season, the Green Bay Packers sat at 12-1 and seemingly had the title locked up. That changed when the team suffered a 7-6 loss to the Bears, which left Green Bay only 1 game ahead of the Portsmouth Spartans, who are now the Detroit Lions. Both teams only have 1 game left, and sure enough, it's against each other. If Portsmouth wins, both clubs will finish 12-3 and force a tiebreaker. Here's the catch. This game was tentatively scheduled, which basically meant that if a team wanted to, they could just cancel the game. And that's exactly what the Packers did. The NFL didn't force the teams to play, so they just didn't. Thanks to this loophole, the Packers won the 1931 NFL Championship. The next year, the 2 teams met again, which the Packers won 15-10. After the game, Portsmouth and Green Bay coaches Potsy Clark and Curly Lambeau respectively had the following exchange. "The officials deliberately handed you this game and you know it, Curly," Potsy said. "We beat you here and we can beat you any place, officials or no officials," Lambeau said. "You remember this, when you bring your overrated 11 to Portsmouth, I'm going to beat you with 11 men. I'm not going to make a single substitution to show you how strong my team really is," Potsy said. Sure enough, the Spartans and Packers met again just under 2 months later. The former was 5-1-4, while the latter was 10-1-1. It sounds ridiculous that both teams are in the running to win the title, but the champion was decided by winning percentage, and ties were just not a part of the calculation. So while Green Bay had a 909 to 833 advantage, it was not insurmountable. The Spartans took the field and Coach Clark stayed true to his word, keeping the same 11 players in the game for its entirety, and enjoyed a 19-0 victory, eliminating the Packers from contention. Due to the Bears beating the Packers the next week, the Bears and Spartans finished with a tie, and for the first time ever, the NFL had a playoff game. Chicago won 9-0 to win the 1932 title. The NFL saw this tiebreaker game being played and was like, wow, we should do this more often. And the next season, the NFL playoffs were born. Finally, let's fast forward just a bit to 1940. Late in the season, the Chicago Bears took on the Washington Redskins at Griffith Stadium in D.C. In a typical pre-World War II showdown, the Redskins won 7-3. After the game, the ultimate Chicago Bear, George Halas, complained that a defensive pass interference against Washington wasn't called. Washington's owner, George Preston Marshall, did what he always did and flapped his jaws to the papers. He called the Bears frontrunners, crybabies, and quitters. Well, exactly 3 weeks later, the 2 teams would meet again in the NFL championship game, and Marshall just wouldn't stop running his mouth. More of Marshall's talk hit the papers, and he followed it up by giving President Roosevelt a gold pass to the game. As the story goes, George Halas put clippings of Marshall's comments all over the locker room walls, went up to his players and said, quote, "Gentlemen, this is what Mr. Marshall thinks of you. I know you are the greatest football team in America. I know it and you know it. I want you to prove that to Mr. Marshall, the Redskins, and above all, the nation." What occurred on December 8th, 1940 is poetic justice. It can barely be called a football game. The Bears walked into Griffith Stadium for the second time in 3 weeks and throttled the Redskins for 60 minutes. They took a 28-0 lead going into halftime with the intention of beating Washington as badly as possible. Chicago intercepted 8 passes, with 2 of them being against Hall of Famer Sammy Baugh. The Bears only threw 7 passes, but instead rushed for a whopping 381 yards. The game was long over, but the conclusion and the final score was fate. The Bears scored a touchdown to make the score 66-0. At this point, the Bears had scored so many touchdowns that they were running out of footballs. The balls just went back into the stands. There was no getting them back as there wasn't a net yet. As substitution, the NFL officials had the Bears try one play from the goal line as an extra point. The first one worked. Then when Chicago scored again, the point after failed. Therefore, the Bears responded to a 7-3 loss with a 73-0 humiliation of everything the Redskins had ever stood for. To this day, it is the biggest blowout in NFL history.